Today I'll show you all my secrets and tips to making an urban suburban garden a big success. I've learned these tips over 10-20 years, and now I think I've gotten pretty close to perfecting the concept. Interested? Here we go. Here is my organic tomato and basil side garden. We have about a 1/4 acre here, and this is at the most exposed to the sun part of the house. The sun starts here on this side and then comes all the way down, and then ultimately gets shadow out here on the trees about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you get a full spectrum of sun. You can see where is kind of concealing the sun for these 2 pepper plants and that basil plant. So that's the difference in sun exposure. The sun will come around here in an hour or so and get these guys for the rest of the day, but that morning sun until about 11 o'clock, these guys don't get much more sun than that. So some of the tips we have this year that we've tried out is we're using landscaping fabric to keep the weeds down, because we want a really low maintenance garden. And you can see we've let the suckers go and grow. This is a Mr. Stripey, and we have electrical 1/2-inch conduit pipe driven into the ground, and these cages are just made out of a wire mesh you can get at any Home Depot or Lowe's, and we stack them up on top of each other, and the plants get pretty high. And look, we're up to around 7 feet, and the plants are going above that. 60 days after planting, and all the plants were this small. Now you've got some killer tomato produce coming in. This year we put down the landscaping fabric. It was brand new, but we've gotten maybe 2 or 3 years out of the landscaping fabric. What we do is at the end of the season, you pull the cages, you cut the plants down to the end here, pull the landscaping fabric up, and then you can turn your soil and get the most out of your plants. The key to successful plants of any kind in a garden starts with the soil. We compost everything from our kitchen and put it in the soil all year round until it's time to plant, and then we put it off in a tumbler after that. We turn the soil, and then when we actually make the hole, we make a much bigger hole than the store-bought plant in its container. We supplement that with some real high-quality organic garden soil to get us really started up on the right foot, and then it's just a matter of keeping it watered, trimming off all the dead stuff at the bottom, and then you get the great outcome of incredible homegrown, best tasting tomatoes and basil that you can have anywhere. The spacing of plants is very important. We've dense packed these, got them in within a foot of each other, and that just leads to diseased plants, and you actually cut down on your production per plant. And the reason why is because the sun can't get to all the different leaves, and we've just found that we get a lot more tomatoes by spreading it out. I think that's about 3 feet, and that's what we try to do when we space these out. It also makes it really easy to get in and pick your plants, because you can go around the whole plant and get the tomatoes out. As the season progresses, we don't even have to come downstairs. We can actually pick tomatoes from our deck, which is way cool. Here's an example of a sucker that just kind of grew away from the plant. These things happen real fast, and so sometimes I'll either trim them off and stick them in new soil like I did down on that part of the garden, try to regrow them in a pot, or in this case, if I'm careful, I can actually weave them in and out of the frame, keep them in place, and it actually stabilizes the whole plant itself. This is an example of what you don't want to have happen on a basil plant. You want it to be nice and bushy like that, because that's going to give you the parts that are edible. When it gets a little too to the flowery point, you have to go down here, and you can usually just pinch it with your fingers, and if you have to, cut it. Now you can certainly eat all of this basil, but once it gets to the flowering stage, then it just doesn't do as good. And so we just take all that away and get it right down to the primal level right here, and that will bud and spread out in 2 different directions and give you much more basil than you would if you just let it flower. So it looks like we're kind of draconian, but we're actually going to get more production of basil out of this plant. You can see that some of the lower leaves are yellowing. You just cut or pull those off and separate those from the plant. That happens every year. We've actually didn't even grow anything last year, thinking that that was going to help us out, and it just comes back. It's just the nature of the beast, I think. Here's an example of a sucker. It happens all the way up the plant every time a leaf branches out from the main stem. Now you can pull it off like this. You can let it grow. If you don't pay attention, it will grow up pretty quick without you knowing it. That will help keep a certain amount of growth. Here's a sucker right here. You can see. We're going to leave that on, or do we take it off? I think we're going to take that off. And you want to use some clippers, or you can just pull it off like that. Totally up to you. But that will help expand the growth of the tomato plant vertical. And then you get all these nice little sprout outs of the leaves, which is harvesting the sun to make your tomatoes. I'll show you what I did with these suckers, trying to rejuvenate them into entirely new plants. So let's go upstairs on the deck, and I'll go into a little more detail there. And I'll show you a place where I just put them in the pot and they are taken off. Here I did an experiment where I just left them in the water, and at the same time I planted them. Now all of these looked much better. We had some significant heat come through, and it really kind of did a toll on the plants. These were all watered well, but I just don't think they sustain themselves in these small containers. And here you can see that the root system is all the way out to the outside. And all I did on these containers is I just drilled holes in the bottom and then put these guys in there. So if I would have transplanted these a week ago, they would have looked a lot better, and they wouldn't be in the condition they are in now. But this long bottle here is the best way to do it. The other thing is, these 2 plants were done with rainwater exclusively, that we capture in rain barrels. These plants are watered with an irrigation system and city water. I'll post a video below, but this is just the ends of green onions that you get in the store. We cut them down to the white rooted ends and then just planted the rooted ends here, and you can see how big they have gotten. And this is just in a couple months. This plant was actually planted by seed, with seeds that were several years old, and only this one took. And then these are just when I took the tops off the plants because I didn't want them to seed. Stuck them in the ground, didn't put any kind of root stimulator or anything, just stuck them in this ground. It's just regular organic potting soil, and boom, they really took off. So we have a whole free supply of basil that we wouldn't have had otherwise if we wouldn't have stuck these in the ground. And these will grow into big bushes. This is my biggest success story so far to date. I just took the suckers and just put them in this basil pot. Just put them in the ground as deep as they could go, and look at them. They are growing tomatoes and getting rather big. You could make the argument that maybe if I left them on the actual bush, they'd be growing and growing faster, but these are entirely separate, independent plants. And you can see, I just noticed I've got a bug problem. Something's eating my tomatoes, so I'm gonna have to take care of that. Co-planting basil and tomato plants just works out really well. I was gonna lock out this video, but then we went away for about 10 days and came back to this. Incredible amount of growth, bursting with tomato and basil production. So I've kind of just wrapped it around here. I've done that in the past. It's kind of going over the cages. You can see down here, right there, I'm just kind of letting that one flop over and see how that works. When we left, it was like a few tomatoes, and now it's just like we're getting 10-15 pounds a day, and that's the basil that's exploding. And here I've just kind of wrapped it around a little bit. It's one of those things, lack of time. Here's the other side down here. I want to show you something though. At the end of the stairs. So they were going so fast that we actually had plants bending over and breaking. And what I did is I took masking tape, and in this case toothpicks, and I made a splint for the plant. And the reason why I use masking tape is because it's not as thick, and it almost has a breathability. And you can see I did the same thing here. And it just gives it enough structure to keep the plant up and to let the plant thrive. This was completely bent over. This one was broken off, and yet it's going right back to business. They were relatively fresh breaks, which I think helps. But let me show you another plant over here. I thought it was a complete loss. And I didn't have any time to fix it because we were literally going out of the door within an hour. So I just took the masking tape, put it around there. That was 2 weeks ago. And the plant, as you can see, is thriving. And we've pulled quite a few tomatoes off of it. And here's some that are going. Now I did lose some of the branch outs, but for the most part, the plant survived because of the masking tape splint. I've never seen plants like this. Usually the stalks get really thick, but this year I think because of the way the weather has been, it's been a little lighter on the temperature and lots of rain. The plants have just gone up and not thickened out at the bottom. Now this one, granted I have to go in here and clean this up. We just got back. Okay, those come off pretty easy. I'm just going to let this one bend over and see how it does. I bent so you can see this plant doesn't need the top of the cage for whatever reason. And so I'll just take these bigger ones and just bend them over and help support them so that it's not a sharp break, and that will allow the plant to grow and produce. Here's another shot of how we're trellising one plant that's getting too big for its cage over to another plant that's not going to use that cage as much. And we've never had this before. The basil is falling down because it's so heavy with top growth. When we left, and maybe you can see it in the previous videos, it was about here. It was about almost half the size or half the height. But what I did is I ended up getting some of these plant props. And they're pretty cheap. You could also make them out of wire, but we just happen to have them. You could use, like, I don't know, 12 gauge wire, 14 gauge wire, and just prop them up like this. And that's helped out a lot to get these guys so they're not laying on the ground like that. But look at these basil plants. They're beautiful, and this year is the first year we're taking the flowers off. We're getting pretty aggressive, and they're just blooming out and getting huge and big and beautiful. So we'll be able to harvest a lot more basil this year because of the process we tested. Here's our lemongrass. It's doing great. Originally, we had a hot spell where it was looking pretty peaked, and now it's just taken off because of the sun and just the amount of rain we've had. We're getting like inches of rain a week. Thumbs up and comments always appreciated. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in gardening, home repairs, breaking things, new designs of all sorts of different things, cosplay, check out my channel and please subscribe. You never know what you're going to see.